hours on Ngunnawal country here in the nation's capital. And we're pleased to say Fran Kelly's back with us again today in Sydney on the land of the Gadigal people. Welcome, Fran. Great to see you back in rude good health. Day 10, of course, brings the first, and you'd have to say it's looking like the only leaders debate. That's scheduled for tonight. Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. Fran will be in Brisbane for their hour-long encounter in front of an audience there of about 100 voters.
That's right, Greg. I'm pretty sure we will end up with more than one leaders debate, but this one tonight is the first one. There will be a lot of sharp attention on it, and both leaders, they like to do this. They play cat and mouse with leaders. But before they get there, the campaign took a sharp turn into foreign policy today on news that Solomon Islands has formally sealed a security pact with China. This deal is in defiance of Australia's advice to Honiara, and suddenly it put national and regional security front and centre in domestic politics right here.
Here, we're going to have a bit of a chat when we get when we sit down. Let's go and have a sit down.
Thank you
have
so
a bit
much.
of a chat.
How are we going, mate?
Here we go.
Raven specialty, this one.
Here we go.
Does this go pink?
It won't go pink.
Won't go
Don't want
pink.
it to do that. So,
We work out at the same place.
Oh, really? Yeah. Gets there early in the morning.
sorry.
Early in the morning.
Early
I
in the
often
morning,
speak to
early
him
bird.
pretty early, and he's there.
You should come and train with
Hi,
us.
how you going,
I thought
Anthony?
I see the start button here.
This one here?
Press that.
We're away.
Well, this is a massive foreign policy failure on the Prime Minister's watch.
This is no surprise to us. It may be a surprise to the Labor Party.
President Biden is sending his lead Pacific negotiator, Kurt Campbell. That's how serious President Biden took this issue.
Now, he is President Biden's top national security advisor on the Indo-Pacific, and we send Zed.
That was clever, whoever came up with that idea. We would have sent Penny Wong, quite frankly, and that would have been appropriate.
I mean, the Labor Party has been very passive when it comes to the risk presented by China in our region. They've been very critical of me personally and the strong stand that I've taken. One of the things you don't do in the Pacific is you don't throw your weight around.
I believe our Foreign Minister should be on the next plane to Solomon Islands to talk with the government to see what's actually been agreed.
Australia is being coerced by China.
So what do I do? It's plastic.
Look, I think tonight is a really good opportunity for people to evaluate the choice. I've said right from the outset of this campaign, this election is about a choice. Don't push that button. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about our plans. We've got some good steps up.
Yeah, so democracy can be a messy business, especially when someone else's kind of gets interwoven with an election of our own here, Fran. Now, the signing, I guess, of this type of security deal between a small Pacific nation and Beijing obviously goes against the wishes of the Australian government, but it does appear that its potency into the future, because we don't know much about it, lies as much in what we haven't yet learnt as what we're about to. The question is, though, Fran, could this possibly have been stopped, and was enough done to even try?
Well, the fact is we'll never know, will we, Greg? It's unlikely intervention would have stopped this or something like this happening eventually. China's been on the move, on the watch across the Pacific for some time. Australia, the US and some Pacific nations have been worried about that. That's why Malcolm Turnbull, when he was Prime Minister, announced the Pacific Step-Up. That's why Prime Minister Scott Morrison has made his first visit as Prime Minister to a Pacific nation. He talks a lot about the family, trying to keep our Pacific family close. It's all designed to fend off China and China's influence, or at least counterbalance it. Did we try hard enough? Well, you know, Scott Morrison today was asked repeatedly that question after Penny Wong put out that challenge about, you know, this is the worst foreign policy failure in the Pacific by an Australian government since the Second World War. Prime Minister's response was, this is a sovereign nation, you have to treat Pacific leaders with respect, we're all one, you know, it's not a sibling parental relationship, it's not about mum and dad and the kids, it's something more even. There has been criticism of the lack of a visit or a very public intervention by the Prime Minister himself, or at least at Foreign Minister level, since we got the leak of this security deal pending just a few weeks ago, Greg. We heard there former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop saying on Channel 10 this morning that Foreign Minister Marise Payne should be on the first plane to Honiara seeking more details of this agreement, because We don't know much about it. We know it allows for Chinese to stock the police in the Solomon Islands. We know it allows them to have police personnel on the ground. We now know it allows for for Chinese vessels to be docked and stocked there in the Solomons. But, you know, we don't know much more than that. In fact, the Solomons Prime Minister has indicated he needs to seek China's permission before he reveals more details. So Julie Bishop making it clear there that she thinks Marise Payne should be going herself.
Yeah, and that's probably not helpful to the coalition government, the Morrison government. Scott Morrison, as you just briefly referred to, Fran, took this question on directly as to whether it should have been escalated above Seselja, the Pacific Minister, straight up to Marise Payne as Foreign Minister, whether she should have been an envoy. Here was his explicit response to that question.
The judgment was made not to engage in a more, at a Foreign Minister level engagement to ensure that Australia's views were communicated very clearly and very respectfully, and that has been done. And this is an ongoing issue. This is an ongoing issue. That secret agreement, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister was very determined to resolve it. There is a lot of influence going on in the Pacific, and there is a lot of pressure being placed on other Pacific countries around our region. And what they need to understand is that I am going to work with them. I'm not going to act like former administrations that treated the Pacific like some extension of Australia. The Pacific Islands are very sensitive to that.
OK, so there have been a bunch of significant statements made by major players here and elsewhere throughout the day on this issue. Why don't we break them down, Fran? I might take you first of all to Prime Minister Sogavare of the Solomon Islands. The Solomons PM tried to give a soothing speech to his own parliament there in Honiara, telling all in the region, Pacific Island nations in particular, that there is nothing to fear from this deal. Here's the Prime Minister.
Will not allow any threats from within Solomon Islands to threaten regional stability. Solomon Islands stability is the region's stability. I will be dispatching my foreign minister to assure our neighbours that our cooperation with China is about peace and well-being of Solomon Islands and the region.
So the Prime Minister there trying to reassure countries like Australia that this is not about, you know, China taking over the Solomon Islands, but there is a lot of scepticism, I suppose, that the Solomons would be any kind of equal partnership with China over time, that's likely to erode no matter what is written in, as Scott Morrison describes, this secret deal. The Prime Minister saying the judgment was made not to, Australia's Prime Minister, that is, saying the judgment was made not to, you know, pursue this at Foreign Minister level. The question is that the right judgment? Certainly Barnaby Joyce, Deputy Prime Minister, no less, has, you know, put it out there publicly that the stakes from this outcome are very, very high. Here's Barnaby Joyce.
Solomon Islands is a sovereign nation, but they've decided to have a pact with China, dual purpose, which means China is able, if they follow this through, to set up a military base there. That will be absolutely, that's a very bad day for Australia. We don't want our own little Cuba off our coast.
We don't want our own little Cuba off our coast. Now, that is a pretty alarming kind of thought or picture to put into the middle of an election campaign, isn't it, Greg? I mean, and that's really almost matched in hyperbole, perhaps, the comment from Penny Wong that kicked off this debate this morning about this being the worst foreign policy failure in the Pacific since the Second World War. Labor really ramping this up through the day. Anthony Albanese saying this is a bad foreign policy failure on Scott Morrison's watch. Now, it is certainly on his watch. Labor really didn't miss the chance, though, to fit this foreign policy criticism, which doesn't necessarily fit into the major themes of an election campaign domestically, you'd think, but Labor somehow managed to jam it into its domestic election narrative.
What we see is a massive policy failure because, once again, the characteristic of this government is on show. A Prime Minister who goes missing on the big questions. A Prime Minister who's always too little too late, whether it's the bushfires, whether it's ordering enough vaccines, whether it's ordering rapid antigen tests, whether it's responding to the floods. This Prime Minister is complacent. He's always there for the photo op, never there for the follow-up.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a potted presentation of the flavour of political debate. It certainly did dominate the day, didn't it, Fran? But there are references that we've already made in our discussion to Seselja. He's the Pacific and International Development Minister. He also happens to be the last and most senior Australian government minister to make a dash to Honiara in what we now know to be an unsuccessful attempt to dissuade Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare. He joined us in the studio here a short time ago. Well, Seselja, welcome back. Your brand of shuttle diplomacy to the Solomon Islands has been denounced by Penny Wong as sending a junior woodchuck, her words. But the Prime Minister, though, says the judgment was made not to engage at full foreign minister level, hence why you were sent. What was the reason behind that judgment?
Well, I think the Prime Minister explained the various levels of engagement that we've had. So whether that's correspondence between the Prime Ministers, whether that's conversations between foreign ministers, whether that's visits of officials that occurred or my visit indeed. So there's been engagement at a number of levels and that was the judgment that was made. But, you know, Penny Wong has been effectively putting out a number of untruths today in relation to this.
Which one specifically?
Well, a number. So she's claimed, and I think she's shown herself to particularly be unfit to be foreign minister. She's claimed that this is a result of cutting aid. That's not true. We have actually substantially increased the aid budget to the region since we came to office. So when the Labor Party were in office, they were spending a lot less when it came to aid and indeed a lot less on other cooperation like defence cooperation in the region. So that's the first lie. The second lie was that we knew about it in August. That is simply not true. And I need to get that on the record.
What was the earliest knowledge that you had?
We found out about it when we saw that leaked draft. So Penny Wong is simply making that up. That's not true. And our officials have confirmed that. So she's...
And yet the Prime Minister has said that the government generally has been alert to this, if not aware of the specifics, alert to this for quite some time. No surprises.
Well, we've certainly been alert to the growing challenge in the region. It's one of the reasons we've stepped up in all of those areas. But for the Labor Party to say how they would have done things differently, well, they spent a lot less in the region. That's one thing they would have done differently. They certainly told porkies about what we knew when. But finally, they claim, and again today, that really it's about climate change. Now, I'm sorry, you are talking about an agreement between the Solomon Islands and the world's largest emitter. So that just has no credibility whatsoever. So this is their claim. What our actual record is record engagement. In the end, despite that, we have a decision from a sovereign government that, of course, we disagree with, and now our job is to work in the region, work respectfully with the Solomon Islands government to make sure that Australia's interests are protected going forward, given they've made a decision that we fundamentally disagree with.
All right, well, I'm interested in exploring that. We won't go uphill and down dale with...
But I think it's important to get those on record, because I have heard those on the ABC, so it's good to get it on the record.
Understood. Thank you for making that clear. Any discussion today within the government now of sending Maurice Payne in light of the deal signed last night?
Well, look, all of those, you know, I mean, sending Maurice Payne or not is not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is how we continue to engage at every level with the Solomon Islands government. So whether that is through ministerial contact, whether that's through officials, whether that's through the fact that we have our ADF and our AFP in the Solomon Islands right now, the level of engagement by our government is strong. Now, we have a disagreement on this, and so as friends, as family, as a Pacific family, we'll continue to express that. We will ask, and we will ask for the Solomon Islands government, and this is something that certainly I raised when I was in the Solomon Islands, we will ask that they be transparent about what is in this agreement. I think that is very important going forward, that the entire region can see what it is, because we have had some assurances, which I think are good assurances, in relation to the fact that there will never be bases and the fact that Australia will continue to be the first port of call and the security partner of choice.
Why do you accept that military basing assurance, by the way?
Sorry.
Why do you accept that assurance? Because you haven't seen the agreement. You're really just taking the word of Prime Minister Sogavare. Is it a bit premature to be accepting assurances about no Chinese military bases?
Well, certainly we have to take at face value the assurances of a leader of a country in our region that's made to their people and to the entire region. So we do take that at face value, but it is important. It is important going forward that there is transparency around this agreement. That's something that we've expressed in numerous ways to the government of the Solomon Islands, and we'd like to see that. And certainly in my discussions with counterparts in the region who have also expressed concerns, I think there's certainly a desire to see this discussed at the Pacific Island Forum, because that's the way we do things in the region. And the region has shown that we can come together, as we did within 12 hours when we were asked to, when there was unrest in the Solomon Islands.
Right, but the Solomon's government has spurned all the overtures so far. Why would this redoubled engagement, either unilaterally by Australia or through the Pacific Islands Forum, make any difference? To what end is that engagement driven now? Is it to try and overturn this, halt it, or is it, in your view, literally a done deal?
Well, let's see what happens, but we are calling for that dialogue, and we have been and will continue to call for that dialogue because it is important. You know, as I say, when I've discussed it with senior leaders in the region, there is a degree of concern. There is a feeling that we did come together as a Pacific family last year. We were able to meet the needs of the Solomon Islands at a very difficult time for them. Our people are still there, and so that dialogue is important and that transparency is important, and that's something that I'd call for again.
Are you curious why Beijing announced the details of the signing? Well, the act of the signing, if not the details of it, first, ahead of Solomon Islands?
Well, really, that's something others can sort of speculate on. What's most important, I think, is that we continue to put our position, we continue to engage, we respect the sovereignty, but we will stand up for Australia's interests. And what that requires now is that there be transparency around that agreement going forward, so that everyone in the region can make judgments about what's actually in it. Just as our bilateral security treaty is public.
Sure, is public, yeah. The timing in the midst of an Australian domestic election campaign, would it appear deliberate on China's behalf?
Well, look, again, others can speculate on that. What I would say is the response of the opposition in Australia in the midst of an election campaign needs to be seen for the political attack it is, given that almost everything that has been said by Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese on it has been 100% incorrect.
All right. Barnaby Joyce, on the issue of military basing, which we've already discussed here today, has suggested that if they follow through to set up a military base there, that will absolutely be a very bad day for Australia. We don't want our own little Cuba off our coast. Has he not received or noted the assurances that have come from the Solomons government?
Well, look, I think we're a long way from that. And as you say, there are assurances from the Solomon Islands government. That's why it's important that we understand what's in this agreement and have some transparency around it. But it's also important, as we have this debate, and we accept those assurances, that we don't have a situation where we have misinformation about Australia's position and what Australia has done in the region. I mean, it certainly doesn't help when you have an opposition that claims to be giving bipartisan support on security issues, simply lying about what we've done in the region, and that's what they're doing. So that is not helpful.
That Barnaby Joyce is misrepresenting the agreement as it stands.
Well, what I'm saying is we've got assurances that are there. As I say, I think it's a long way from there, but at the moment we have an opposition who are making claims that are simply false, demonstrably false, and obviously that's for their own political ends rather than the national interest.
Okay, and the US envoy, Kurt Campbell, soon to enter the region. Do you think he'll be able to flush out this transparency around the agreement, the publication of it, backing up your calls here today?
Well, we certainly welcome the US engagement, and I think those are important discussions. I think it's fair to say that our engagement with the United States has been at the strongest it's been in a long time, really, with the AUKUS agreement. We have seen a deep level of engagement by the US, so we welcome that. Yeah. We absolutely welcome that, and so those discussions, I think, are very, very positive.
Let's see where that takes us. Seselja, thanks again for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, as we just heard, Labor has criticised the government's response to the Solomons signing that security deal with China. Labor's Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific is Pat Conroy, who joins us from Newcastle. Pat Conroy, thanks very much for joining us.
Afternoon, Fran.
This morning, Senator Penny Wong described, she was critical of Seselja being sent as the envoy on this recently. She described him as a junior woodchuck. Given you're the shadow foreign minister on international development and the Pacific, do you see yourself as a junior woodchuck?
Absolutely. I'm proudly a junior woodchuck, and Penny was absolutely right to point that out. This is the greatest security blunder in our region since World War II, and the fact that the Prime Minister did not send Foreign Minister Marise Payne was a disgrace. In fact, we've also established that on the day that Minister Seselja, the junior woodchuck, left for the Solomon Islands, Marise Payne was doing a Liberal Party fundraiser in Sydney. If that was more important than our national security, what does it say about Mr Morrison and the Liberal National Party?
Well, you heard Seselja there saying that Labor is just peddling lies, really, misinformation. Senator Payne this morning, the Foreign Minister, said she's had a lot of engagement with her counterpart in the Solomons. Is this really, in the middle of an election campaign, is this really an issue to be playing politics with?
We're not playing politics at all on this, Fran. Facts matter. Fact number one, this government has cut foreign aid by $11.8 billion.
Well, the Minister just said, aid has increased substantially in the region.
Well, Fran, at fact two,
do you accept that aid to the region has increased? Let's clear that up.
Fran, if I can answer your question.
No, let's clear that up, because you said that cut aid. Has aid to the region increased or decreased?
Aid to the Solomon Islands has been cut by 21%. On the government's own figures since 2018-19, overseas development assistance to the Solomon Islands has been cut by 21%. That is the government's own figures. So Seselja can spin it how he wants. The foreign aid budget globally has fallen, and the bilateral aid budget to the Solomon Islands has fallen by 21%. So for Marise Payne to not do her job and not go to the Solomon Islands is a damning indictment on this government's approach to national security.
I'll leave the aid debate aside, because there will be numbers and damn statistics in this, and the government can show that in the Pacific Step Up, which was introduced by Malcolm Turnbull, there has been more aid to the region and more defence cooperation in the region. But this is a serious moment in geopolitical realignment. China, the emerging superpower, has been flexing its influence financially and structurally in the region for some time. Why would Australia, no matter who's in government, be able to hold them out?
Well, for decades we've been the partner of choice, and to finish my point on the aid budget,
but the world is changing. China is an evolving superpower.
Fran, the most relevant fact is aid to the Solomon Islands, and this government has cut it on its own figures. On your broader question about the entry of China into the Pacific Island region, that's because a void has been left by Australia. The government has admitted that by rebranding things as a Pacific Step Up since 2018, which implies that they left a void before 2018. This is a government, Mr Morrison and Mr Dutton, who make jokes about climate change, who make jokes about water lapping at the feet of Pacific Island nations, who've cut aid to the Solomon Islands. So it's no surprise that nations like the Solomon Islands now are looking at other security partners such as China.
Yeah, so we need to be clear here, though, about the timeline.
To blame.
We need to be clear here about the timeline of, changing relations with China. Australia's relationship with China has changed very much too since 2017, hasn't it? So has China's, the way we view China's introduction or development of its relationships in the Pacific. That's a change that's happened there. What should the Australian government have done differently? What would a Labor government do differently now?
Well, first off, I agree with you that the deterioration in relationship with China is because of changed behaviour by China, and that's really important to be bipartisan about that. In terms of what Australia could do differently with the Solomon Islands is first, not cut a bilateral aid budget to the Solomon Islands. Secondly, actually honour the Boy Declaration that Marise Payne referred to this morning, where every nation who is a member of the Pacific Island Forum agreed that climate change is the #1 existential threat to security in the Pacific Island region, and actually do real work, actually be a part of the international community in terms of taking action on climate change, rather than being in the naughty corner with countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. Whenever I talk to Pacific Island leaders and representatives of those communities, climate change is the first issue raised, and it's opened a door for other nations, is this government's approach to it. The fact that this government then, through Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison, make jokes about it is rubbing salt into the wound. The fact that Prime Minister Morrison at the 2019 Pacific Islands Forum was seen as bullying other Pacific Island leaders to ensure that the communique did not emphasise climate change just demonstrates demonstrates how this government's actions in the Pacific have alienated Pacific Island nations, and we are paying the price for that now through the greatest security blunder since World War II in our region.
But just on climate change, the opposition leader Anthony Albanese was asked today if a Labor government would sign the UN pledge to ban coal. He said no, it wouldn't. But at the same time, he, as you have just said, is that climate change is the #1 priority for Pacific nations. That position is not going to endear us to Pacific nations, is it?
The most significant focus of the Pacific Island nations in terms of Australia's climate policy is getting us to increase our ambition to have a 2030 target that is scientifically responsible and part of global efforts to combat climate change and to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. That's why Labor's commitment to 43% reduction by 2030 is much more in line with what Pacific Island nations want rather than the government's 26% figure, which is based on accounting tricks. So the most important thing in terms of playing our part in global action on climate change is having a domestic emissions reduction target that's consistent with action around the world. Labor has committed to it. This government has refused to do so, which has left a void in the Pacific.
Oh, so it goes back to what a Labor government would do if you were in government. We've got China signing this security pact now. China in the Pacific offering loans. In the Solomon, it's even offering cash through something called the Constituency Development Fund, where individual MPs actually get a slush fund, basically, to hand out. I mean, if that's what the Solomon Islands leadership are wanting, Australia couldn't match that no matter who was in government. We never would we?
Well, we'll outline in the next few weeks what our Pacific policy is, but a few things that we've already indicated is first that we would have sent Penny Wong as Foreign Minister, and Anthony Albanese has committed that if we are privileged enough to be elected, that he would seek to visit the Solomon Islands as a sign of re-engagement with the region. We obviously have committed to much more scientifically and internationally responsible climate targets that will improve our standing in the Pacific. We've also signalled that we will be looking at how we can improve military cooperation and economic and maritime cooperation, and to improve the operation of the various Pacific labour schemes that are really important to that region. So we've already signalled significant initiatives that will improve our relationship with the Pacific, and we'll have more announcements to make in the next few weeks.
Pat Conroy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran. Have a good afternoon.
OK, well, I'm not sure they'd both accept the description, but we've just witnessed the battle of the junior woodchucks.
The junior woodchucks.
Although,
well, Pat Conroy accepted it wholeheartedly.
He does. Seselja, not so much, I suspect, although we didn't want to dwell on that in our discussion with him. But I think one of the final points you raised there with Pat Conroy probably goes to the nub of this, doesn't it, Fran? We are seeing on the shorelines of Solomon Islands this classic clash between democracy and autocracy. So the Australian approach, if we can divine one which is bipartisan, seems to feature key words of respectfulness and sovereignty, recognising Solomon Islands sovereignty, up against what the Prime Minister calls very persuasive promises and all sorts of investments. You reference those yourself. Cold, hard cash.
Cold, hard cash. You know, there's all sorts of allegations being made about where the Chinese cash is going, but there is definitely that thing I talked about there, which is called the Constituency Development Fund. Taiwan apparently started this. China is continuing it. It's actually cash going into the hands of MPs, and we all know where that can lead, Greg. So there's no way under Australia's foreign policy that would ever be able to be matched. So there are those elements, as well as the fact that, you know, I suppose the Solomon Islands is looking around and thinks, where's the emerging superpower in this region? And it's choosing to put its eggs in that basket. It's not the only country playing footsie with China, that's for sure, in the region, but it's also not the only direction that the Pacific Island nations are going. There is concern. In fact, there were talks again today between some Pacific leaders, the US and Australia, about how to manage relationships generally in the region. So it's this is a major geopolitical realignment going on before our very eyes. We probably will not know the degree reality of the geopolitical sort of change we're witnessing right now, Greg, for another, perhaps 10 years.
No, and it'll be there to confront whoever is in office come, say, the 22nd of May. Fran, we'll be back with you again shortly, but we might turn now to our political panel, which has a definite Queensland flavour to it today. LNP Senator Susan McDonald is in Townsville with a signature backdrop behind her, and Labor's Murray Watt is in Brisbane. Because you are both Queenslanders, the Coral Sea begins not far off your coastline. Why don't we start, Susan, with this question about the Solomon Islands, and is it feasible? Could this security pact have been prevented under any circumstances, do you believe?
Well, I think Australia has had a long relationship with the near neighbour, the Solomon Islands. It is the third biggest aid program that we have, $160 million. We have provided assistance in all sorts of humanitarian and other aids and relationships. I think it's really unfortunate that the Solomons has made a decision to turn towards China, and I hope they've reflected on what's happened in Sri Lanka and other nations who've gone down this same road and lost ports, lost other infrastructure when they haven't been able to meet repayments. So I think it's very unfortunate, but we will continue to have a relationship with the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, and a question we put to Seselja, Susan, do you think the timing here, at least on Beijing's part, deliberately injected this issue or sought to smack bang into the middle of an Australian election?
Oh, that's an interesting idea, and I certainly know that the Greens have made statements about being strongly supportive of a greater relationship with China. I think that Labor has certainly been portrayed as having a greater relationship with China. We've had a great trade relationship with China, but certainly these forays into our geographic regions are, more concerning. And whilst the Solomon Islands have said that they will maintain a defence relationship with Australia, I am concerned that what will happen with China as they try and make a more economic stand in this region.
A little Cuba off Australia's coast, as Barnaby Joyce put it, Susan. Just finally, I'm getting to you, Murray, momentarily, but is that a description you would endorse?
Well, I think that China has said that they will be investing in the Solomons, that they will be intervening if there is local conflict. It's a pretty scary thought to have them so close and have a defence position.
All right, Murray, thanks for your patience. This idea that, history doesn't happen by accident, it may well be Beijing's desire to have disrupted the Australian election with this discussion today. To that extent, they've succeeded, haven't they? Divide and conquer?
Well, I'm not so sure, Greg, that it's got anything to do with the election because, as we all know, this is something that has been a long time in the planning by China. The government was first warned that this was a risk back in August last year, and as you've heard from other guests, the Morrison government didn't even think it was worthwhile sending the foreign minister to make representations to Solomons. So this isn't some new thing that has happened overnight in the middle of an election campaign. This is something that has been coming for a long time, and as usual, what we've seen from Scott Morrison is that he and his government have been missing in action whenever there's a crisis.
Noting that, Murray Watt, do you therefore conclude that this could have been, if not prevented, then perhaps even delayed through escalated Australian diplomacy?
Well, I think that sending the foreign minister, as Labor would have done in the same situation, probably would have made a difference. But also, of course, there are other things that the Morrison government has done which have no doubt contributed to the situation we find ourselves in. Being laggards on the international stage, and particularly in the Pacific when it comes to climate change, cutting aid payments to the Solomon Islands, these sort of things don't exactly endear you to other countries in your region. And now, of course, we see the consequences of that. I think it's a really serious day for Australia and Australians, and it's a terrible day for the Morrison government because all of their national security credentials are now in tatters. I mean, this government continues to bang on about how they're the best people about national security and the economy. They're the test they set for themselves, and what we've now seen is China essentially on the way to setting up a base about 2,000 kilometres from where Susan is sitting right now, and an economy where we've got more debt, more deficit, and wages that aren't growing than we've ever seen before.
With that statement in mind then, just last one to you, Murray, on this topic. Would you therefore share Barnaby Joyce's view that the Solomons could represent, quote, a little Cuba off our coast?
You wouldn't find me agreeing with too much that Barnaby says, and this is another example of that. So, but I think what it does show is that this is a much more serious situation than what Scott Morrison has been trying to pretend all through the day. He's trying to say nothing to see here, nothing to see here, it's going to be okay, and his own deputy is out there shining a light on what a serious situation this is. Right. And I think it's just all Australians will be worried about this development.
Okay, a couple of other topics to get through. Industrial...
Greg, I just would have to say, though...
Go ahead, Susan.
Greg, I would have to say, though, it's a massively long bow to draw that the Solomons would be turning to China because of Australia's lack of action on climate change. Australia has a commitment to net zero emissions, as opposed to China, who is increasing emissions. So I think that we have to be very careful that the rhetoric doesn't get away with our reality.
Understood. I heard the Prime Minister making that point a little earlier. Can we go to the matter of free speech? And I'm, of course, referencing Catherine Deves, the Liberal candidate for Warringah. Susan, are you clear on how an anti-transgender or self-described pro-women campaigner has become, in the course of this campaign, a totem for free speech? Are you supportive of those who say this is about trying to disendorsing her, or calls to disendorse her are about cancelling culture?
I think that we have to be clear. There's two very different things there, anti-transgender as opposed to pro-women and girls in sport. So I certainly do support that women and girls are able to compete in an environment that is appropriate, that is they're competing with people who have similar, strength and agility and all of those things, and it's a safe and fair environment for them.
And so letting Catherine Deves... so letting Catherine Deves espouse these views, is that a freedom of speech issue in your mind? That's the Prime Minister's presentation on it today.
Yeah, I think Catherine has withdrawn the language that she used. I think that on reflection she wouldn't have used the same language. I certainly wouldn't have used that language. But I think we do have to talk about issues that are important for Australians, and in this case sport is an important part of growing up and being an Australian. I look forward to the day when there is a transgender category that people can compete on a level playing field there. But for girls and women, I do feel strongly that they should be able to have their own category that they can compete in safely. And
is that something, Murray, that the next Parliament would or should be looking at? I know it's been touted by private senators' bills that this should be addressed through new federal legislation. Do you share that view?
Well, as you would know, Greg, these matters are already dealt with in the existing legislation, the Sex Discrimination Act, and the way that this is approached at the moment is to essentially leave it to sports and sporting organisations to make their decisions about these matters, and that's what we think is the right way forward. I mean, the fundamental problem here, though, is that this whole debate has exposed another massive rift within the Liberal Party in New South Wales, and it's any wonder that the Prime Minister gets distracted from things that your everyday Australians are worried about, like cost of living or, turning up to fix up flood disasters or bushfires or anything like that. He's too busy interfering in things in the Liberal Party that come back to bite him, and here's another example of that now. All
right, quick one finally to each of you. Murray, have you been one of the rehearsal dummies for the leader tonight? You got the leaders' debate, and we read of private rehearsals, mock debates. Have you been involved in that?
No, they have much better qualified people than me to do that kind of thing, Greg. But I ran into Albo at the venue for the debate just before when I was talking to another media outlet, which I won't name. And he was looking in fine form. So I think he's ready to get out there and show his true colours. And I think people will be really pleasantly surprised to hear what Albo has got to say and the focus that he's got on what people are really concerned about.
Bring it on, Susan.
I think they will be surprised if Albo gets through the night unscathed. He's had a terrible start to the campaign, but we are all human, and I think it would be unrealistic to think that we'll never drop the ball. But, I was desperately shocked to discover he didn't know the unemployment rate, didn't know the cash rate. This is not safe hands to be handing over to when we are in, we've had COVID, we're coming out of COVID, we've got all sorts of military uncertainty around us. But
Sure.
yep, I'll be tuning into the debate. I think it'll be fascinating.
Well, I'm sure they'll both have been well schooled by the time they get there this evening, and we'll certainly be watching. Susan McDonald and Murray Watt, thanks again for joining us and bringing a uniquely Queensland perspective on things this afternoon.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, Greg.
And today, Prime Minister Scott Morrison continued his defence of controversial Liberal candidate for Warringah, Catherine Deves, saying he won't allow her to be cancelled over her views on transgender women athletes.
I think Australians are getting pretty fed up with having to walk on eggshells every day because they may or may not say something one day that's going to upset someone. Now, you shouldn't seek to upset anyone else. You shouldn't seek to upset people. You should deal with things in a very sensitive way. But in this country, I think it's time to allow people, where they have made mistakes in the past about how they have said things in the past, where they're prepared to put those behind them and focus sensitively on the issues they're seeking to promote, then that's how they do it. Others might want to cancel her. Others might want to cancel other Australians for standing up for things that they believe in, but I'm not going to have a partnership with them.
Well, the Liberal candidate, Catherine Deves, has described trans children as, quote, surgically mutilated and sterilised. Her group, Save Women's Sport Australasia, campaigns against the inclusion of trans athletes in women's sport. I'm joined now by Tracey Holmes, the host of the ABC sports program The Ticket. Hi, Tracey. And Kate Palmer, former CEO of the Australian Sports Commission. Kate, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Hello.
Kate, let me start with you. You're a leading sports administrator here in Australia. How big an issue is the inclusion of transgender people in sport? In women's sport?
Well, it's certainly an issue, but I don't think it's at the top of the list for sport in these times. There are many more critical issues to deal with. And I think it actually puts sport in a really difficult position because sport is doing a terrific job of including people in their organisations and their community sport. And this is putting them off track. So for me, it's not an issue that they need to deal with critically. And in actual fact, they dealt with it a long time ago. We released the guidelines into the participation of transgender and gender diverse people in sport in 2019. And all sports then got to and started looking at ways that they could be more inclusive and welcoming to everyone in sport. So this is not a story that is appropriate, and certainly the language isn't appropriate. Sport deals with this in a very, I think, a very sensible, sensitive way.
But when you say, just to stick with you for a moment, this is not an issue where the language is appropriate, but is it, I guess I'm wondering, now that the issue has risen again, is it rising from the sports themselves? Is this a discussion going on within community sporting organisations, elite sporting organisations, to your knowledge?
No, look, it is something that is dealt with as part of inclusion policies, and most sports, following the release of the guidelines, did develop inclusion policies. Sports would deal with as a matter of course from a governance perspective. They need to review their policies, if not annually, biannually. When issues like this come up, certainly I suspect all sport boards in this country will be looking at their CEOs and saying, you know, have we dealt with this appropriately? And but it's not something that is a daily occurrence. There are so very few issues. And what they're more focused on is how they can make people feel welcome. How could they include everybody in their communities, because they want to grow. And they also understand the value, the power of sport in connecting communities and being really welcoming and safe. And so for me, yes, it actually brings it to the fore. It means that boards will be sitting around boardroom tables saying, what's our position on this? Let's check our inclusion policy. Are we seeing some challenges? And I suspect there are, from time to time, issues that arise, but it is very rare at the moment.
Tracey, let me ask you, you've been covering this issue since it emerged some years back now. You've been covering it all the way along. How are the sports dealing with it? Have they got policies that are working? Are there more concerns growing as the issue is becoming more and more, has more and more of a profile? Is it a major thing?
Look, it's not, because, Fran, to be honest, there's some organised lobbies that are very, very powerful in the USA, also in the UK, and of course the one that Catherine Deves has been spearheading for some time. But I remember interviewing one of the first transgender females participating in sport, transgender women, back in the early 1990s. So transgender women have been competing in sport in this country for many, many decades. This conversation is really targeting very few people who are competing at the elite end with not a lot of understanding of the science, which is being debated on either extreme. And this is part of the difficulty as well, that people will go and handpick the science that they want to use in order to reinforce their ideas on this issue, which remains a very small issue on a small number of people who are already extremely marginalised.
OK, but as you say, there have been a few high-profile cases recently. It's very big. It's been a contentious issue in the American college sport in particular. We've had the recent high-profile case of the US swimmer, Leah Thomas, 6'1", I think. She stands on the blocks, who was the first transgender woman to win a title in American college competition. She beat 2 Olympic silver medalists. Much is being made of this, that it's unfair. There's a structural disadvantage there. What do you think?
People talk about the fairness of sport, and I think what they disregard is that these people we're talking about at the elite end are the 1% of 1%. It's a very small group of people who are not ordinary. They're all extraordinary. They all have advantages in some sense. There's more than one 6-foot swimmer in female swimming.
Yeah, but if you're a silver Olympic medalist and then somebody arrives who people haven't heard of much, what explains that?
So
Is
they
that
haven't
fair?
heard of much because they don't follow it until it becomes an issue that somebody has blown up. In Leah Thomas's case, the situation is she won a 500-yard event, which is not contested at World Championships or Olympic Games. The 2 silver medalists from the Olympics that she beat, one has come from the 400-metre individual medley, the other one is a 1,500-metre specialist. Leah Thomas's winning time was 10 seconds slower than the record at NCAA for that event. So again, this is people going out and hand-picking what sort of evidence they want in order to prosecute the position they are coming from. I've spoken to a number of transgender women who compete in sport in this country or have competed in sport and overseas, and some of them have said, can you just stop talking about this, because all you're doing is putting, a red rag to a bull in this regard, and the genuine concerns are not being discussed. Others have said, please keep talking about it, because there's so much misinformation out there that we need to try and bring, some of the actual science and the facts and figures to this. So, of course, people have concerns, but we need to talk about those issues in a well-informed way. And some of the framework that Sport Australia put together, and Kate has just been talking about, is the framework that sports have been using predominantly without incident in this country.
OK, Kate, so let's go to some of the details, the facts, as Tracey's saying, important to get out here, because we know this is a very difficult and sensitive issue for many trans people. Trans people are vulnerable. They have high suicide rates, one of the highest suicide groups collectively in the nation. We need to be, careful and sensitive how we talk about these issues. But what was the science that you helped around the guidelines you helped to develop, if you're looking at issues of, fairness and safety? How are the sporting codes using the science to develop codes that make it safe and make it fair? What are they doing? Are they measuring hormone levels? Are they measuring heights and weights? What are they doing?
So the guidelines themselves were developed by the Human Rights Commission, Sport Australia and the Coalition of Major Professional and Participation Sports, so the largest participation sports in Australia. And the focus of the guidelines was around the law, the legislation, the Sex Discrimination Act, and that protects everyone. But it also provided a number of case studies, really good examples of how sport is more inclusive. So it goes through a range of steps, almost like a roadmap for sports to develop their policies. And in actual fact, they're doing this very well. From a science perspective, the focus of science, and Tracey's well equipped to provide more information on this, most of the international federations set rules or guidelines, policies that generally the national federations in each country comply with at the elite end.
Okay.
The objective at the community level is to not say why, it's to say why not. Why aren't we providing a better environment, and why aren't we being safer and more welcoming? And look, when we released the guidelines, for me, the really wonderful thing was we received lots of letters from trans women saying thank you, and they gave really great examples of how they were participating in communities and being so welcomed. And this was, in fact, a lot of regional and country communities were really proud of the way that they were so welcoming.
Okay.
So the guidelines are still setting a standard for sport to follow, and most sports now are upgrading their policies year on year based on changes. But in terms of the science, it's a very complex issue, and having read the latest from sports like cycling and cricket and athletics, they're starting to be, the good thing is there's starting to be more consistency in the rules that they're putting in place.
Okay. Can I just, before we run out of time, Kate, let me go to Tracey on that, because Tracey, of course, has covered so many Olympics. We've seen the IOC case, Tracey, I think, change tack on its position. What is the science that the elite sporting bodies are using, and is there a consistency within it, as Kate's saying? Is that starting to emerge?
Well, we're hoping it's starting to emerge. Some of the sports bodies are commissioning their own investigations, but there are other investigations that are being done in areas like the US military, for instance, and the Air Force has done a really thorough investigation, which has probably given most insight in this area in a lot of the science that I've read. It shows very clearly that trans men close the gap to cis men in regard to performance, and trans women, their performance reduces almost to the standard of cis women over a 1 year. It needs to be longer than a 1 year period. So
is that because of hormone deprivation? Hormone deprivation,
well, testosterone deprivation, but they also take estrogen, which again kind of multiplies the effect. And this is part of the difficulty, is that transgender women particularly end up getting to a point where they go into almost spontaneous menopause because everything in their endocrine system starts to break down. So their performance continues to go on a downward trend.
Okay, just finally and briefly, Kate, this is all happening, this conversation now in the middle of an election campaign. Is everyone walking on eggshells, as the Prime Minister says, just briefly?
No, not at all. And I look up, my desire would be from all sides of politics to actually focus on things that women in sport need, which is more investment, more infrastructure, equal opportunity. There's an opportunity for politicians to really lift up women in sport, and this is certainly not doing that.
Tracey,
yeah, look, I think it's fabulous that sport is dominating this election cycle.
Well, sort of sport.
Well, no, it's definitely sport.
Yeah.
But, if you were to pick the top 10 issues in women's sport right now, this is not one of them.
OK, Tracey Holmes, Kate Palmer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.
Tracey.
Thank you.
Okay, interesting chat, Fred, and I wonder to what extent that issue that you're just discussing, transgender sport, might filter through, if at all, in the leaders' debate tonight. Of course, the format is meant to be members of the community, ostensibly swinging voters, asking the issues of concern to them. I'm not sure that's necessarily a barometer of how prominent this issue is in the campaign, but if not that, there's plenty of other ground that I suppose will be tilled this evening, cost of living being one of them.
Yeah, that's right, I think. And, is the issue of trans women in sport or cancel culture going to trump cost of living? I'm pretty sure that most of the focus groups that are being done, and they've been done every night, everywhere around the country at the moment, Greg, would say probably not. Yeah. Will it get an outing tonight in the leaders' debate? Well, you just never know, do you? But I think both both leaders have really staked their ground out on this issue today. This debate tonight, that's the challenge of an outing with the public. You don't know where it's going to go. As I say, I think the challenge for Anthony Albanese is to try and show people who he is. Who is this guy? Does he sound authentic? Does he sound passionate? Does he sound energetic? Is he saying things they can relate to? He's going to be trying to keep the message on the cost of living. I think both sides are. And they're both coming at that from different ways. Like the Prime Minister's coming at cost of living through, 4% unemployment, giving people jobs. That's how you manage to pay for the cost of living. Labor's trying to get its policies out there around childcare, for instance. Real cost of living issues around the kitchen table. So I think we're going to see those messages, the leaders trying to jam them in, but they'll go wherever the questioners take them, and we don't know where that'll be.
And having seen a few of these, Fran, how would you describe your level of enthusiasm? Bated breath, or there have been a few fizzes over the years, let's face it, haven't there? Although this format does actually lend itself to a little more dynamism than perhaps some of the older tried and tested formats.
Yeah, to be honest, they are often fizzes. We have this big build-up and we read a lot into it, and we used to get body language experts in. Can you believe that? I don't think we do that anymore. I do think this town hall format is more interesting. I think it's trickier for leaders to navigate, but that just might make them more cautious. The last one we saw with Bill Shorten and Scott Morrison, we had that moment where Bill Shorten accused Scott Morrison of being a space invader because he got into his face. Right. They can have these moments, but generally, well, I'm excited, Greg, but then,
we're tragics, I guess.
We are.
And
Here we are.
I suppose the final reflection on my part anyway, Fran, is that this parliament that just ended was somewhat subdued because of COVID and the pandemic generally. So the opportunity for Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese to really thrash it out in parliament has been limited, I suppose. If you look back over the course of their leaderships respectively, head to head, hasn't been a lot of it. So that kind of makes tonight interesting.
Well, I think that's especially true and makes it most important for Anthony Albanese. Because of the pandemic, he really was deprived of centre stage politically for much of the time. Parliament didn't sit. And as you say, the Prime Minister stood alongside premiers for much of the last 2 years. So he really couldn't sort of find much of a chink to get in there. Tonight is perhaps his first day, really, his first opportunity to be centre stage alongside on equal footing with the Prime Minister, and he really needs to make the most of that.
Yep, we'll maybe assess that tomorrow when we're back together. Fran, it's great to see you again, back on air, fit and healthy today. We'll do it all again tomorrow. That is afternoon briefing for today. A farewell from both of us, and more stories coming up, of course. Stay tuned on ABC News in just a moment. But yes, afternoon briefing back at the usual time. We'll see you tomorrow.
Tonight, Australia's greatest minds face up to their own mortality. Death.
Do you spend any time thinking about how or when you might die?
I think about